I've just got the cue. We will begin. I am Steve Grundman. I'm the MA and George Lund Fellow for Emerging Defense Challenges here at the Atlantic Council. The purpose of this panel is twofold. It will explore the perspectives of practicing artists on the central question of this conference: how the highly dynamic international security environment of our 21st century world, one that's being given steady impulses from the advent of new technologies, will disrupt our conceptions of and planning for national defense and military affairs. The first of artists' perspectives on this question I want to draw out of our panel concerns the renderings themselves, the conceptions, visions, narratives they have created to animate our imaginations of this disrupted international security environment. Secondly, I think we should be equally interested, at least I am, to hear about the methods artists employ to envision the future of war and social conflict. Because I can tell you both from my own experience, my wife is an artist, and from talking to these gentlemen over the past couple months, they do think different, to coin a phrase. But before I go on, permit me to call out something which I think has been overlooked, which I really regret, and it's this. And that is to say, it's an issue brief that we have just published today. It's really was designed to be the sort of the foundational essay of this conference. It's entitled Disrupt or Be Disrupted: How Governments Can Develop Decisive Military Technologies. It's available at the reception desk if you haven't already picked a copy of it up. It's been written by Jim Hassick, who's here somewhere in the audience. He is a non-resident senior fellow here at the council, and the rest of his life is at the University of Texas, and by Byron Callan, who is there on the aisle. Byron is the Director of Defense and Aerospace Research at Capital Alpha Partners and is a member of the Atlantic Council. Look, none of us in Washington has time to read things that are not good. And I can tell you, I would not commend anything to you that wasn't worth the 10 minutes it would take for you to read this essay. I think when you do, you will agree with me. It is, well, maybe short of profound, but a really cogent, incisive essay on the topic, and which in fact delivers the goods that's in its subtitle: How Governments Can Develop Decisive Military Technologies. Okay. I didn't want the day to end without that being remarked upon, because I think this is an important product of the conference that I think had not otherwise been drawn into relief. So I will confess I feel compelled to justify a little more than maybe a moderator should have to do this panel, because the topic, the art of future war, is a little off-key to a Washington think tank on this question. And the panelists, I won't say are off-key, but I will say, maybe they're even a little off-key, but I will say that they're different voices than you've heard before. So I'm going to take a minute to, if you will, justify a little bit and perhaps overcome what skepticism I can see and hear in your minds as to why this question is a worthy topic, and these particular voices on it are going to be instructive of what the overall conference is about. Right, so these three gentlemen are, I think it could be said, exemplary of those new and or younger voices, the need for which has been one of the recurring themes of today's deliberations. They really do think different. A further testament to the fact that they're new voices is the fact that all of them had to get on an airplane to attend this conference in Washington, which is probably a good litmus test, I think I might suggest, for whether it's an actually new and different voice.
I've never actually been to Washington at all. This is my first time. That's how radical it is.
There we go. That's how new it is.
The Air and Space Museum.
Ooh. Well, you've got some work to do. Okay, I have asked each of them in the course of their own introductory remarks to elaborate on who they are and what they do that's germane to this topic, so my own introduction to them for the moment will be quite brief. Dave Anthony is a writer and producer of video, most famously of the Call of Duty series of video games. August Cole is a writer, analyst, and consultant who specializes in national security issues. He's a fellow at the American Security Project and writer-in-residence at the consultancy Avocent. David Brin has truly earned the title you see on this agenda: scientist, author, and tech futurist. Among his prolific output of cogent provocative stories and nonfiction essays are the celebrated titles The Postman, which was made into a movie, The Life Eaters. By the way, it's not The Life Easters, which is in his bio in your hands, which maybe I didn't need to point out, except I thought it was funny. But it's The Life Eaters is the proper title of that work, and The Transparent Society. So there are two very specific impeti. These impeti range across my own 30 years of professional life for my organizing this panel with these gentlemen at the capstone of today's panel, and indulge a little story here. So the first of these impeti is a dark winter night of 2014 when I read the closing chapter of Lawrence Friedman's fairly new book. It was just published last year called Strategy, A History. Those of you who don't know who Lawrence Friedman is, I think it can fairly be said he is the preeminent scholar of strategy, particularly military strategy. And the closing chapter of this book, Strategy, A History, a chapter which basically takes up the what's next and new in strategy question, which he, I think, feels compelled to answer because he more or less says there's been nothing new in the discipline of strategy since about 1979. Maybe Michael Porter, 1982. The title of this last chapter is Stories and Scripts, says Lawrence Friedman. Now, for students and practitioners of strategy in any realm, I think Friedman's book has a nearly Talmudic significance. It is brimming with quotable verses that I will cite a handful of here, simply to suggest to you why it inspired in me today's panel. In the very preface, he describes strategy. His most concise definition of strategy is, quote, the art of creating power, the art of creating power. In this final chapter, he, quote, explores the value of considering strategy as a story about power told in the future tense from the perspective of a leading character. Quote, he says, strategy is meaningless without language and communications. Not only are stories instruments of strategy, they also give form to strategy. Narratives have moved to the fore in the contemporary strategic literature in military, politics, and business. In order to come to terms with recent trends in thinking about strategy, he compels the community of strategists, need to come to terms with stories. Scripts, he recommends, provide a way of addressing the problem and about how individuals enter into new situations, give them meaning, and decide how to behave. It also has a natural link with performance and narrative, unquote. So all of this in this dark winter night of 2014 reminded me of a dark winter day in January 1984 when I arrived in near Nuremberg, West Germany, to take up a position at the U.S. Army's 1st Armored Division. And the battalion commander greeted me, and he said two things, which I remember distinctly. The first thing he said was, fix that drag-ass surveillance platoon you're now in charge of. And the second thing he said was, read this. And he handed me a copy of a book entitled The Third World War, August 1985. Keep those dates in mind. I got there in January 1984, and the book I'm asked to read is The Third World War, August 1985, by General John Hackett and a group of compadres, erstwhile mates from NATO, all of them retired of various sorts. So this book had been given to me because the commanding general had been Dave Palmer. General Dave Palmer had been, among other things, a history professor at West Point, and actually, so the relevance of which is that the Third World War, this book, the conceit of it is that it was an historical account of a future war. Any of you who are familiar with it, those of you who aren't, I'll simply say, as the account played out, and if you combine with his account a memory of, quite poignant for me, the rather heightened Cold War tensions that predominated in the first half of the 1980s, you can imagine what a sobering, and I would even be willing to say frightening, effect this book might have had on a second lieutenant under whose charge had been placed a manifestly substandard platoon of guys whose mission was to head out to the forward line of troops when the balloon went up. Written against the mid-1970s, the backdrop of the mid-1970s, the ulterior purpose of Hackett's book was to galvanize the Atlantic Alliance against what he and other prominent voices in the post-Vietnam War era regarded as a progressive disillusion of the resolve and capabilities of NATO to confront the Soviet threat. So the combination of these two Britons, Lawrence Friedman and General Hackett, got me preoccupied with the following thought, which has led to the organization of this panel. It's that fiction and other works of art are sometimes the best expression of what I'd call structured imagination, of the sort that it takes to make complex projections tractable. Right? So what Jules Verne was to submarines, what William Gibson and the whole cyberpunk genre of fiction is perhaps to our modern conception of cyber war, so too, may I suggest, are Dave Anthony, August Cole, and David Brin, or maybe to our formulation of compelling visions of how actors, targets, and technologies could play out in the 21st century. I dare say that if the Atlantic community is going to renew itself for the global challenges of the 21st century, that's the mission statement of the Atlantic Council, by the way, renewing the Atlantic community for the global challenges of the 21st century, it's going to need some kind of compelling vision like Hackett's to galvanize its resolve and capabilities. And no less an authority on defense strategy than Lawrence Friedman is now commending to the professional attention of strategists the techniques of stories and scripts. To take up this discussion, we've assembled here three artists who could not be more well suited to the task. I've asked each of them to start the conversation with a few minutes of their perspectives on both of the two questions. What are their visions and what is their method? Are there methods? After which we'll have a conversation among ourselves and with the rest of you in the room. I'm going to first turn to Dave Anthony. And before any of you who may be tempted, any of you as old as me, who may be tempted to dismiss the worthiness of a video game to the topic at hand, have not spent any time looking at Call of Duty Black Ops 2. I am not a gamer, but my son is, and I could spend a whole evening learning and really enriching my own imagination about the future of warfare by watching, I did this actually, by watching this video game, Black Ops 2. And it was exactly that experience that prompted me to say, I gotta find the guy responsible for this and put him on this panel, and he was gracious enough to come and do that. So let's start with Dave Anthony.
Well, exactly on that subject, Steve, I really salute and applaud you for putting this panel together. It's very outside the box, and I was equally delighted and honored to be here. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Despite all of the gracious things you've said, I'd still say about 90% of the people here are thinking, what is this nerd who makes video games doing in this room? And
I think you could start with that expectation.
10% are thinking, that's the guy who made Call of Duty. So what I want to do
and they want to go home and tell their children.
Right.
So what I want to do just very, very quickly is just say where video games are basically at right now. When I first started playing them, which is longer than I care to remember, it was in the late 70s. Video games were very different. I was playing Pac-Man, Space Invaders. You could make that game with one person probably in about 5 or 6 weeks. Black Ops 2 was made over a 2-year period. I managed and directed a team of 300 people internally at the studio that made it, and there were 500 people externally that worked on the game for 2 years, non-stop, and spent about another year actually maintaining it. The development budget, purely just to make the game, was about $100 million, and the marketing and sales costs on that all totaled to about $400 million, just to make one game. So that's where games are at right now. And you know, when you see Call of Duty the game, it's the equivalent of an 8-hour movie that has multiple story outcomes. All the main characters can live or die depending on what you do, and you have to handle that within the story. You know, it's 8 hours long, and it's essentially, and it has like real actors in it. It has, you know, we had Gary Oldman, Ed Harris, Kiefer Sutherland, all working in these games. So it's not Pac-Man anymore, basically. So
and it is, I dare say, someone here correct me, a bigger budget and more people over a more enduring period of time dedicated to the question of envisioning something, in the case of Black Ops 2, a conflict in the year 2025 than our much vaunted Pentagon is committing to the task. I think that would be fair to say.
Interesting.
You came to Washington.
I did. I heard there was 125,000 people in the Pentagon, actually. That's pretty impressive.
I don't think there are 800 of them working on this problem.
So anyway, so what is Black Ops 2? What is that vision of the future? Black Ops 2, you essentially play a Navy SEAL, which is part of the equivalent of DevGru or SEAL Team 6, which in 2025, as you said, is basically tasked with locating and capturing the equivalent of the Osama bin Laden of essentially 2025. This was the first Call of Duty game that actually went into the near future. So it was vitally important to me to make sure that the authenticity of the previous Call of Duty games, which have largely been set in World War II or modern times, was not compromised. I wanted this to feel real. I wanted it to feel like when you're playing this, that it's actually a plausible scenario using plausible technology to actually fight this conflict. Didn't want it to be too retro, like something like Mad Max. Didn't want to go too far into the future, like Star Wars. So I worked with a bunch of consultants, actually, to actually really ensure that this would happen. And we're going to see two of them in a video that we're going to show you right now. I put this video together to basically try and scare the hell out of my team in terms of telling them what the future conflict might look like in 2025. So can we roll the video?
Alex, are you both? Okay.
Right, so a little snapshot there of what the game was like. Whenever I see that video with Peter Singer and Oliver North, I always feel like putting a 5-minute clip of Seinfeld on afterwards because it's so scary. That, what could possibly happen?
Just to diffuse the moment a little bit.
Yeah. I forgot to bring it though, so sorry about that. So anyway, so what does the war of the future look like in Black Ops 2? Well, in 2025, we envisage that war is no longer just rows of guys slaughtering each other on a battlefield. I mean, things have just fundamentally changed. And I've always loved the idea, which is sort of based on the David and Goliath thing, of the stronger that you become, it can actually, in an ironic way, make you more vulnerable. So we came up with the idea of what happens if your own technology is used against you, which has been a recurrent theme even in the conference today of, what are the dangers of, cyber attacks and, things that are being run basically by computers, particularly as they become autonomous with like mission packages that were described earlier today. So, so the villain in Black Ops 2, it was not a country versus country. It was an individual. It was an individual actor who had access to actually the criminal networks that General Dempsey actually talked about this morning, to access to vast wealth. And he actually leveraged social media technology to actually generate himself an online presence, but under a very benign personality. He actually co-opted the support of a lot of hackers, and he actually used these hackers to actually ultimately gain control of the entire US drone fleet. And not only did he do that, but he actually sent all the signals through China's satellites, so it looked like China had actually taken control of US drones fleet, even though it was actually nothing to do with China. And this villain actually wanted to basically bring down capitalism. So he actually, the way he wanted to do that was actually to have the two superpowers fight it out under this almost bogus conflict. So, and there was a line I always remember from one of the trailers we did, where one of the generals of the US, when they finally figure out what's going on, and they say, well, how's he going to destroy us? He says, well, he doesn't need his own weapons because he's got ours. And it's a pretty scary concept, and that's what we based the whole sort of story around. So, coming to Steve's question of, what's the method of creating sort of a world like that? Well, first of all, I had 3 consultants that I absolutely relied on very heavily to create the story. And you saw 2 of them in that video, Lieutenant Colonel North and Peter Singer, who's probably pretty well known in this room, I would imagine. And also a guy called David Goyer, who is a Hollywood screenwriter, probably the most successful in Hollywood right now. He just wrote the latest Superman movie, and he wrote the last 3 Batman movies, among many others. And the reason I had those 3 individuals was I wanted a very different perspective from each one. With Lieutenant Colonel North, you get the military perspective, the strategic perspective. From Peter Singer, we got the futurist perspective. And from David Goyer, I got the perspective of a true artist. And everybody came at it from very, very different points of view. And this is where the real creativity came from the game. And, sometimes we disagree on things, and, sometimes say, Dave, are you crazy? And I'd say, yes, that's my job, right? And then I would, say to Colonel North, it's your job to kill crazy people who think like me, because they'll come up with crazy things to try and attack the country. And it's like, we think like crazy people, and this is how we sort of bounced ideas off each other. And the creativity was amazing. Like, none of us could have done it on our own. Absolutely not. The story, each person was very, very critical to developing that story. So, and the sort of premise in 2025 was there was this Cold War between America and China. And we didn't want to do an actual global conflict because, as in the first Cold War, you had it was talked about today, the mutually assured destruction idea, where you can't really use nuclear weapons because everybody's just going to get wiped out. We have, in the future and even now, economic mutually assured destruction in some ways where, even look at what Russia's doing right now, even imposing sanctions on Russia, obviously in Europe could create problems, particularly as Europe has an economy that's, maybe if not teetering on the edge, it certainly has some problems. So we thought a Cold War would be the best way to sort of explore that, but we buried the actual threat of the game in the background of that. The actual threat was not the Cold War between America and China. The actual threat was this unpredicted individual actor who had leverage to a large criminal network.
Might you say disruptive?
It could be disruptive. That could be a good word. And it was the failure to anticipate this threat and not be able to react to deal with it, which was ultimately the problem that the country had to face in the story of this game. Now, I tried to come up with an analogy of something that could be good to relate to this. So I thought of, I actually thought of how could you compare the US military to something? And I thought you can actually compare it to the Call of Duty franchise, which may sound completely crazy, but think about it. The US military is by far the most powerful military force the planet has ever seen. Call of Duty is the most successful video game in the history of the world. And, people are trying to attack America all the time, whether it's individuals or nations ultimately. Call of Duty, we're trying to get, for the last 10 years, the competition has been trying to bring us down. And they have the same problem. And the problem is, and it was partially discussed earlier today, where, the country is under so much threat that you spend all your time reacting to the threat and you don't have the time to be proactive to deal with it. Well, we have the same problem in the franchise. The franchise is constantly under threat from the competition. The game makes a lot of money and all the competition wants a piece of that and they don't get it. And we've been doing this for 10 years. So we need to develop strategies to actually develop things in the same way that the military has to. But to actually develop a proactive strategy is something that I believe you can actually do alongside reacting to things, as long as you use a different set of people and it's integrated in the right way to actually deal with that, because that's what we have to do, and that's why we've been so successful for the last 10 years, is because we have a significant portion of our team dealing with the proactive ideas on how we can beat the future, essentially. And it's not always easy because we have a publisher that is very, and I'm sure in the same way that the country's defenses is very risk averse. They don't want to change anything because the game's making so much money. It's making $2 billion a year. It's like, why do they want to change it? And I say, well, I fight this all the time. You have to change it, because if you don't change it, people are going to get bored with it, or the competition is going to take you out, and all the rest of it. And it, in some ways, becomes a circular argument. Mm-hmm. But we have fought for these things, and we've demonstrated over time how this combination of proactive and reactive can work to actually sustain the franchise. So, but if you look at the actual, if you look at the threat to the nation, it's pretty formidable. I must say, having sat here today listening to all the things, it's, I think I'm going to move back to England. No, I'm not actually. I'm applying to be a citizen. But it's pretty daunting. It's an impossible problem, and it's been discussed today. How can you realistically predict what's going to happen? And you can't. It's absolutely impossible. Look at what happened a few weeks ago. I shudder to think of the amount of money that's been invested in the TSA to, beef up security in airports and things like that. And a 15-year-old kid hops over the fence and goes to Hawaii on the landing gear. And luckily, he wasn't a terrorist, because he could have caused some pretty significant problems. So, how do you combat something like that? And regards this panel, as we've been assembled here, how could you leverage artists, or not necessarily just artists, but people outside of the bubble to actually try and help with this? And, I think if there was some sort of collaboration even on a full-time basis with these people, something that's not based in Washington, mm-hmm. something that artists will be able to do is they absolutely come up with outside-the-box ideas, because Steve was right when he said earlier, we think differently. I think we are partially insane, and I think it helps. Maybe completely.
We'll be the judge of that.
And so we think of outside-the-box ideas, and our job actually, and I think David mentioned this earlier, is we analyze patterns. That's what we do. So we analyze patterns, and we generalize solutions. So we can think of all the crazy ideas that we could think of how the country could be attacked. We can actually analyze patterns in this and come up with generalized solutions of how things, because you can't predict what's going to happen, you actually have a set of generalized solutions available if certain types of things happen, if that makes sense. And one other thing about artists, which we could not, I guarantee you, have made the Call of Duty games, which have to be delivered on the same date every year, or I don't think I would get fired, I think I would get killed if it didn't make it. And we have to cut through bureaucracy and red tape. There's no other way to get the games done. We just can't work like that. And I know, obviously, within the existing structure, there's lots and lots of that. So I think another challenge is, which has been talked about today, how do you navigate that? But if you look at a very successful model, like we had the panel on DARPA earlier, where that is, obviously, it's not a completely autonomous entity from the military, but it's a very self-contained unit, and people have very, very much pride in what they do. And I can tell you, with our team who makes this game, DARPA is worshipped like you would not believe as an entity. So that's about it, really.
Okay, that's a great start. I just want to register a couple things about what Dave has said that disabuse maybe mine and other preconceptions about what and how artists operate. One is not all artists are in a garret somewhere. It can be a highly collaborative enterprise, artistry. The other point that you made is now escaped me. And so we'll turn to August. I first met August Cole when he was the defense industry reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and he was a great reporter. And I'd like to think, or I certainly would think, that the journalistic community was feeling at a loss when he decided to give it all up, move to Boston, and turn to fiction. But he's done that, which is a brave and admirable thing. But by dint of his experience in journalism and focus on national security and defense issues, he's a really well-informed artist, writer of fiction that concerns national security.
Thank you, Steve, a kind introduction, and I want to thank the panelists, starting with Dave, whose books, like The Postman, which came out when I was around 12, 13, help me come to grips.
I said young and different. Is that what right?
Here is a book that,
just to guard both David and me,
that helped somebody young coming to grips with the Cold War, coming to grips with apocalypse. Put a kind of a human face on the experience, on the unthinkable. And Dave, I was going to say, it's not so much that as much as I owe, I guess, being here to some of the work to David to my right, but you, Dave Anthony, I almost missed one of the most important job interviews of my life a few years ago by playing a video game that was so immersive and so engrossing, very much of this same type. And I say that to say that I think I have the gene, right? The gene, that lets you get so lost in an idea or in the pursuit of something that's both visual but also visceral. And when I tried to, I think, kind of run from that for a long time. I was a history major. I worked as a very serious journalist. And I've come to see real value now, though, in that mindset, in that ability to get lost in thinking about your world as it is and the world as it might be. I think that's something that can be very hard to do when you are in the middle of a crisis, which a lot of jobs, no matter what sector or field you're in, often feel like. You have to be engaged, you have to be always on, and you don't necessarily have the space and time to think creatively about your world and even a future world. So some of what I'll quickly talk about will be kind of where I come from and how I look at the future, and then a bit about methodology and maybe some of the things that I do as a writer that could be helpful to you and your organizations or with the people that work for you. And so I'm going to speed through some of my comments because I think there are people here like Mr. Brin who can speak to this process better. But this is clearly a time when we're open to new ideas. This conference is testament to it. You hear it outside of Washington, too, when it comes to the debate around national security. The world is moving faster technologically than the defense establishment can keep up with. Companies themselves that are supposed to be pushing the envelope are looking to their left and right and feeling threatened as well because the metabolic rate is simply advancing so fast. It's hell for a lot of people, to be honest. But for writers, it's awesome. You could not have a better environment, a better sort of spectrum of things to pick from when you're trying to get into storytelling and looking in the national security realm at our futures. And I am looking at the future. I have not I've been most comfortable looking both in the near future and the far future. To me, that is a place where you can start to extrapolate from the things that you see today and also engage some of the things you're not seeing in the future. I'll talk a little bit about why you should listen to writers, and I think Steve did a great job in doing so. But we can really afford to be wrong. We don't get fired for coming up with an idea that doesn't come true, or we may not sell any books, but that's something that, like quote-unquote artist has to be, I think, prepared for. Van Gogh sold like one painting in his whole life when he was alive. We'd love being told.
And you keep telling your wife that, right?
Yeah, that was the line one in my business plan for trying to be a writer. I may not sell anything. When you tell us something can't happen or we can't do something, I think that is fuel. I think that is just the match. That's really more of an igniter. It's the igniter to the kind of intellectual kindling we built up, and we're ready to just let rage. And that is something that I've found extremely challenging and rewarding in kind of carrying out. There is also a desire to be disruptive in the moment, but also in a lasting way. I think there is a lot of art, especially visual art, painting, film, that has done so in how we think about conflict. A film like Apocalypse Now by Coppola, or a 19th century painting by David, The Oath of the Horatii, that really talks about sacrifice and duty. I mean, in a moment, you can capture a feeling in a visual that will last and shape how you see your future. When we think about, this notion of creativity, you've heard it talked about a lot recently, and it's something that I think could become a bad word in Washington, because creativity can be thrown about as a solution to deal with less money, with less resources. I believe the efforts to introduce that word into the kind of defense bureaucracy are sincere, and I applaud it, and I hope it is very real. And it's something that I think needs to be considered when you're talking about this question of future warfare, because if you root yourself too closely in your own world, you'll miss the world as it's evolving. And when I think about the future, I tend to look at the near future, which is maybe the 5 to maybe 10 years out at the most, and then the 20-year mark. I think once you get beyond that, you're almost liberated a little bit further. The near future gives you a way to build a world that you can kind of push back a little bit and get comfortable first and start to understand where things may not be falling your way, what you have control over and what you don't. I think things about the way we consume, for example, media, the way we consume conflict, if you will, the GoPro generation, being able to put a cam that's their own on a patrol, or being able to turn to YouTube for a very visual representation of what conflict looks like, both our own and others. The other things that really are starting to kind of meld, and you're seeing future come a little bit closer when you look at, it's like sub-threshold warfare, what Russia just did, or is doing rather, in Ukraine, is something I think that 2 or 3 years ago, when I was playing with a manuscript that was going to deal with a character who needed to go into Iran, I thought a sub-threshold sort of takedown of the Iranian system, the political and economic and telecom system, would be a great way to do so. And you're seeing that manifest. But the far future is where it gets really interesting, because here is where you really get to think about the thing that you want to have happen least, it can happen. And you have the intellectual space to do so, the freedom, like I said earlier, to be wrong. You can turn your biggest strength into a weakness. A powerful and wealthy standing army can be a liability. A technological edge suddenly will not work when you think it most should and most need to. Those are the kinds of elements, I think, that we don't often give enough due time today in our debates about the future of warfare. It comes down to voices, too. There are a lot of voices you don't want to hear in terms of the architecture of a lot of these worlds. Dissident voices, dissenting voices. Those are also elements you can incorporate into your reality in the future in a safe way organizationally, as much as in your own kind of creative stream. I think to talk a little bit, too, about disruption, it is an abstract term, and I think it's something that can be hard to wrap your head around. It's not something you can budget to. It's not something you can, well, if it's really disruptive, you can't even plan a meeting or a conference around it. It's happening to you. It's like an avalanche. You kick it off, but you don't know where it goes. So I think in the way you look at it in this room, you can try to personify it. I mean, I thought one of the exercises that might be interesting to do after you've had your happy hour here would be to try to imagine almost a character, the most disruptive person you know. You think of their name, you think of their gender, where did they go to school, or what tribe are they from, like what their laugh sounds like, what they think of when they smell like a freshly lit cigarette. Did they walk to school to get water as well, or were they driven, in a chauffeur who sang the Star-Spangled Banner? Those sorts of personifications of abstract concepts that are extremely relevant, extremely timely, can be helpful to understanding the ramifications of those very things in the future. I think being able to think about that person, would you trust them to watch over you at night? Would you say something to them on the metro if you saw them? That sort of an exercise is the kind of thing that I do to try to understand how to take something in the policy realm and put it into a tangible, touchable, readable form, really. You know, you're trying to take a reader on a journey in these worlds, and it has to be very much about a person that has the kind of traits or characteristics that we can all identify. We may hate them, we may love them, but no story is as good as its hero, and no hero is as good as its villain. I think those sorts of dynamics are enduring in storytelling, and they always have been. A little bit about kind of creative methodology, and then I'll wrap up. I think you need to carve out space to work, and you may have to trade things for that. You may have to quit your job. You may have to tell your boss you don't want to get promoted because you want more time to work on an abstract project. But then you earn and own that time. You have a responsibility for it that is very real, and that puts pressure on you to perform, which is good. You know, writing is a competitive game, and that competition you're in is with yourself. You know, obviously it's a commercial, you know, entity and venture too. Any publisher or agent will remind you of that every time you talk to them. But I think you have to really be willing to go toe-to-toe with yourself and overcome any anxiety, commit to moving ahead even when you don't want to. There's a physicality to writing, I think, too, when you're tired. Maybe it's because I write early in the morning, and you are trying to get into that most lucid spot, which can sometimes come from being a bit dissociated. I think you need to know how you work best. You need to know when you're fried, how to take a break. I ride my bike, I'll go skateboarding sometimes. The things that I can do that involve trying to stay upright or stay alive, you know, really, I mean, this is biking and skateboarding, not anything more serious. You know, those free up a little bit your creative elements. And I think if you have that impulse yourself, to try to figure that out. I have a friend I used to surf with a lot when I lived in San Francisco. He used an Excel spreadsheet to track his best days. And I tell this story because I used that very model to figure out when I wrote best, when I was awful, when I hated the words I'd put down. And that let me be a lot more efficient, going back to that notion of kind of owning your time and making the best use of it. So thank you guys again for coming. There's a lot at stake, and I think creativity has a lot to merit in the consideration of this world that we're seeing unfold in front of us, whether it's in the near term or whether it's 2 decades out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, August. Actually, your remarks reminded me of where my thought process after Dave's intervention went off the rails, and that was, again, to sort of disabuse, let's at least say me, of these preconceptions I have of who artists are and how they work, is many of them, maybe all of them, it has to be said, are working in a highly competitive environment. Again, they're not living this somehow detached, perhaps poverty-riven, although it may be that too, but they're working in a highly competitive environment with deadlines and discipline and a number of things that I think we don't reflexively associate with artists. And when we fail to associate those characteristics with them, we decide, oh, they're not for this kind of problem. We're working a serious problem where you're supposed to sit behind a computer from 8 until 6 every day, not the time when you can actually be productively creative. Okay. And finally, but hardly that, David Brin. David was introduced to me by my Atlantic Council colleague, Banning Garrett. Thank you, Banning. Banning is a senior fellow in the Strategic Foresight Initiative, which is in the Scowcroft Center. Any of you who may doubt my claim that David has well earned the fantastic title by which he promotes himself should take note of both the subtitle of the Transparent Society, which is, Will Technology Make Us Choose Between Freedom and Privacy, as well as its publication date, 1998. A more topical subtitle for today, I cannot imagine, and it says something about David Brin's mind that he wrote that book in 1990, published it in 1998.
Yeah, well, it's one of the few public policy books from the 20th century that's still selling more every year. and I have absolutely no qualifications. An astrophysicist, sci-fi writer who decided to write a book about transparency and freedom. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this event. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'll just make a quick plug. Tomorrow afternoon on K Street, I'm talking to the Internet Society about the transparency, surveillance whole thing. So I won't get into that here today. And Friday morning, I'm at the MITRE Corporation talking about some more specific national security things. But Saturday is the reason why I came out here. I'll be on stage with Brian Greene talking about sci-fi in the future and multiverses. And I haven't lost any hair, it's just switching hats. Stephen Hadley discussed Secretary Albright's concern about this objective versus subjective, and how the real battle lines on Earth today have got to be won in the realm of the subjective. And that's one of the reasons why we're on stage today. Because when you stop and think about it, there is only a limited period of time in which General O'Reilly and his peers can stave off the natural human chaos, the natural order of things, which has always been interregnums between Pax empires, in which chaos reigns, and with our given weaponry today, possibly utter disaster. Or the problems of during a Pax era, when there's the temptation to create the standard human social structure, which is a pyramid of power. Elites ruling over masses below, hyper-conservative and therefore brittle and unable to deal with onrushing tomorrow. Our Enlightenment experiment is best typified by a diamond-shaped social structure in which the well-off, middle class, and a super-empowered middle class of the society's capable people is dominant and outnumbers not only the rich, but also outnumbers the poor, which has never happened before, and is emblematic. Not only that, but there is churn within the diamond. Your parents do not control. Who they work does not control your destiny. A large fraction of it is self-earned. And the inclusion of ever wider horizons, and the notion of the positive sum game that the diamond rises. This has been tried before in human history. It was tried in Periclean Athens. Thucydides' rendition of Pericles' funeral oration is an absolute must-read, because you feel, all right, this was tried. Somebody got it before Adam Smith said the words, before Franklin and Jefferson said the words. It's been tried on occasion and routinely squashed. We have a window of time that you are trying to buy us, and it has to be looked that way. And if we remain the same people on this earth, fractious and divided, eventually your ability to anticipate, all of you in this industry of yours, it's based upon the prefrontal lobes, which are the little nubs above the eyes the Bible refers to as the lamps on his brow when they're referring to Moses. And if you go to Michelangelo's statue of Moses, probably the greatest sculpture in human history, in a small church in Rome, you'll see that he has horns on his head because this was mistranslated. They didn't know what it meant, lamps on the brow. But the prefrontal lobes are the organs that we most recently developed that enable us to do what Einstein called the Gedanken experiment, and that is projecting ourselves either into the future. What might happen if I spread this rumor, or I propose this proposal, or wear this, or try to run through this yellow light, and thereby enabling us to find a fraction of our mistakes. But also, it is the seed of empathy, because we say, what if I were that person? What might she be thinking? What might he be thinking? And this is not just empathy that turns into sympathy, but the empathy that our warriors need in order to figure out what the stalking predator figures out. What might the deer be thinking? In other words, how best to defeat our opponents. These prefrontal lobes only kick in the mid-20s, which helps explain teenagers. Do I look fatigued? The point, we're going to have 3 in college next year. The point, though, is that the distinction between the objective and subjective is somewhat artificial, but it's still an extremely important one here. Because what you folks are trying to do, and what we've spent the day hearing from others, and there are sincere meetings all over town all the time about this, is how to better use these prefrontal lobes to do the act of anticipation. Anticipate where the problems are, anticipate where the threats are. And we fortunately live in a culture which is unlike any previous Pax power. Dr. Grant spoke of doctrinal disruption. And if you look at every Pax power up until ours, they committed the same error. And that is smugly assuming that the war that they previously won would be the next war. Talk about the French. This was, don't learn anything. They gave us the left-right political axis too, which should be abandoned if for no other reason because it's French. C'est absolument fou. But the point is that the Marshallian spirit that was developed by the greatest man of the 20th century, by far, he should have been on Time magazine, George Marshall. One of the many things he gave us was the tradition in the officer corps and other parts of this town to worry about the next war, which is traditionally what the losers of the previous war do, as when Guderian, for instance, was the only reader of the book by Liddell Hart, and in Britain and France, nobody read Liddell Hart. This is tremendous. It's one of the reasons why Pax Americana has been able to survive longer and better and less hated than any other empire, is because of this tradition of trying to question and what assumptions are we making that might be wrong. But there's a problem with this. It is still based upon assumptions that anticipation can work. And anticipation can only stave off the surprises, as we learned in 9/11, the day that not one action by any member of the professional protector caste worked, but almost every action taken by empowered citizens worked, including the one that ended the war and won it that day. And that was the rebellion of the citizen soldiers aboard Flight UA-93. And that is why I raised this question, and I do every time I come back east, about whether or not the assumption that is very recent, just one generation, that we must make this transition away from the American tradition, that our professional protectors are a tripwire, a thin blue line whose job it is to die, buying us time to line up and avenge them. And instead, we have blithely, without comment almost, switched over to a Praetorian model, which works as long as it works. And when it fails, well, on 9/11, the citizens stepped up. Rebecca Solnit, S-O-L-N-I-T, wrote a book, Paradise Made in Hell, absolutely important book, about how the stereotype of disdaining of the citizen has been disproved repeatedly. And this is exactly what Putin was talking about in his recent speech, in which he derided the hegemony of diversity, the decadence of the American-led West. And this is almost, if you had simply done an Arabic translation, what Osama said, and almost exactly what the Soviets said, and you work your way back every 20 years. Every enemy that we have had has rationalized that we have our toys, we have our successes, we have all these wonderful things because we did a zero-sum trade-off. And the thing that they rationalized that we traded off was our manhood. Hitler said this, Stalin said this, our manhood, so to speak, our virility, so to speak. Forgive me, we're coming up with new words. But our ability to be resilient, our ability to have soul. And always the rationalizations sound almost the same because they are what a zero-sum thinking enemy must think, because they cannot stretch their mind to the notion that the positive sum game that we engage in intrinsically allows us to have our toys, our pleasures, our incredible citizen incoherence and diversity, while being strong and capable and resilient. So I want to, and the thing is, this is not a rare thought that our protector caste wants to improve their anticipation. I am one of a dozen or so science fiction authors who are flown back here twice a year. One trip, it's the CIA, another it's DTRA, another it's DOD. A month ago, I spent all day in the Pentagon. There are serious people, including more brilliant lieutenant colonels than you could shake a stick at, who are very serious about wanting to find the anticipatory gaps. But they still miss the deeper assumption about citizenship, which is the ultimate source of resilience, and the deeper question of how we can win. And the way we win, instead of putting off the inevitable, what happens to every Pax Empire, the way we win is through narrative. It's through the subjective. It's the way we've been winning so far, and that's through Hollywood and the assumptions that are spread mimically, that the individual matters, that rambunctious questioning of authority matters, that whatever is not specifically forbidden is automatically allowed. One of the deep positive sum assumption sets that almost no other civilization's ever had. All of the assumption sets that are built into a diamond-shaped social structure. Plus the prosperity of spreading jobs around the world, this was mentioned earlier. These are the methods by which we can reduce the seemingly infinite supply of super-empowered, angry young men, which is our fear, because they're going to be more super-empowered as time goes on by having molecular Macintoshes on their desktops. It's the way we increase the supply of allies. We increase the supply of volunteers and of STEM kids who are willing to do the STEM that we need in order for them to be truly useful creators of new solutions. And it's the way we increase our supply of willing taxpayers. And unfortunately, we are having counter subjectivities foisted on this republic right now, stimulating and reigniting the American Civil War. Because if you wanted to destroy our ability to be adaptable, resilient, and solve these problems, and be attractive to the rest of the world, because that's how we deal with the fact that the Chinese are, we have an open society, so they're always going to be able to steal more than us, always be able to spy more than us. But we have the counter strategy of being so impressively attractive that we will get defectors, voluntary spies. That's always been our equalizer. So the exacerbation of our current civil war is, I think, our worst problem right now. And we can try to deal with that with mythology, with the right mythology. Here's a piece of mythological propaganda that I'd love to see erected a few blocks from here. The national debt clock. Do you remember how it broke down when we were, the funny thing, there was technical malfunction when we were going up during the periods when we're running in the black, because it didn't suit the narrative. I would love to see some millionaire put up next to it a national debt clock that shows what the national debt would have been today if the United States federal government had gotten a 5% royalty on US government research, taxpayer-paid research. From satellites and rockets to telecom to the internet, what it would have been. Not that we should have, but the propaganda effects would be staggering, in my opinion, and we need more of those, and I could come up with some if you like. I might have to take issue with Oliver North in more than one way, but the trend, yes, we may tumble into a very violent epoch. But the tendency, as pointed out by the Harvard professor Steven Pinker in The Better Angels of Our Nature, has been towards reduced violence, less violence, every decade since the nadir of human civilization in 1943. And so far, nobody seems to be commenting upon the fact that the rules of engagement of every decade of our military are less accepting of collateral damage, less accepting of civilian damage, and more becoming like SWAT teams and less like in military engaged in what used to be acceptable, horrific levels of leveling the populations everywhere we were angry. I'll just finish off by saying, yes, there is a whole range of ways in which narrative is done. There are honeypot concepts that are sometimes irritating. In Hollywood, you never see an American institution or citizens portrayed as being more competent than slime molds. And the reason for this is complicated, but it is undermining. And what we need, and what some of us are trying to do, is to develop mythologies that speak to the possibility that you can show dramatic protagonists having all of the adventure of a dramatic story arc and impulse-pounding danger for 90 minutes or 400 pages without spreading the poisonous notion that civilization is useless, your nation is useless, all of its institutions are useless, and your fellow citizens are nothing but useless braying sheep.
On that note, I'm going to ask Barry's indulgence to run this over by 15 minutes, just because I think there's enough out here, and there are obviously still attentive people in the audience who might like to engage these a little bit. I will ask one and only one question, because ever since, David, you started talking about the instrument of the populace, I have wanted to bounce off you the following thought, which I had recently. Are you calling for what I might call, just as an example, a counterinsurgency app? So imagine if the millions of the 70% of the population in eastern Ukraine who did not vote in the quote referendum on Sunday had an app or had some capacity, were somehow empowered by us through this technology, which probably half of them at least are carrying in their pockets. Is this getting to what you have tried several times today to draw out of speakers, and I don't think anybody's quite addressed it?
I think that's absolutely right. This is emblematic. It is what worked on 9/11. It's what did not work at Katrina and did not work in Fukushima. And Qualcomm, I've consulted for them on this. The chips in these phones already contain within them the capability of doing what would increase American resiliency by 10% overnight. And Verizon and AT&T have refused. And that is to have a backup peer-to-peer text passing capability when the cell phones aren't within reach. If that were the case, any place that was suffering disasters, people would be able to get primitive telegraphy out. And if the whole nation suffered a degradation, deliberate or accidental, from a solar flare, we would still be able to send telegraphy from coast to coast. And all it would take is a decision to institute this. Apps, those will also include sensors.
So to speak, apps, figuratively perhaps.
Pollution sensors, which will either encourage self-righteous neighborhoods to defend themselves or be part of a general sensor network that would feed information into our professional protector caste. These don't have to be contradictory.
I confess I asked the question with a little axe of my own to grind, and that is that in framing this debate about the adequacy of our defense strategy and posture to the 21st century problems like Aleppo and Crimea, that debate tends to get framed between a lack of will or an absence of will, whereas I look at it and it seems to me we don't have a military capability that is germane to the commander-in-chief to do and affect those problems in a way that is, that creates the trade-off of effect and consequence that he's looking for, and that and we need a defense strategy that motivates those kinds of innovations. I mean, again, maybe figuratively, the counterinsurgency app is something that we need a defense strategy to be prompting this enormous community of way more than 800 people who are trying to develop systems that solve military problems. Questions from the audience, right here. Please tell us who you are and speak clearly.
Graham Jenkins from the Cytor Corporation. I should say, while it's not 800 people, it's like a couple dozen. The Pentagon does have the Office of Net Assessment, which is probably the closest thing to the outside
Andy
the box.
Marshall, I saw him a month ago, yeah.
Oh yeah, he's
Amazing.
still.
But
still
you're
kicking.
making the point, it's a couple dozen people, he had
Right.
800.
No, sure. And then I had a question that I'm sure you all have very different answers to, but in terms of thinking long-term, near-term, et cetera, there's sort of two biases that I think you run into. One is where you set the point of divergence when you're thinking, especially in the near term. It's really easy to expect things to continue along more or less with some slight change, slight improvement, but at some point you have to decide what significant changes are going to happen in the environment, and especially in the long term. And when you start extrapolating that out, that leads to increasingly outlandish scenarios and that sort of thing. So I guess the two parts are, how do you start that change? How do you start by figuring out where it'll change? And in the end, how do you bound that? Where do you reel it in and be like, this is a little too out there?
Could you start, August, because I think your comments addressed this timing issue most
And
directly.
Give us a hint what you're doing with Peter Singer.
At least a hint, August, please.
So the background that you have as a writer is rooted in fact. I mean, I think a good fiction writer has to know, it's like being a physicist. You have to know certain fundamentals, and I think that applies when you're writing about national security. But I think the really privileged position you get to be in is to take assumptions first, and maybe your most dearly held ones. And to some extent, those are easier to upturn the farther you go into the future. Again, I make a, say, 10-year, line in the sand. You could play with that for tomorrow, too. I mean, to some extent, it's what is your objective in trying to think something through. And, you may need to go through multiple iterations. I mean, I think there is a boundary that we bump up against in terms of that's a really dumb idea, like we are going way too far with an idea, with a concept, or, there are certain realities we want to adhere to, because you need to engage your audience. If you lose them, then the whole thing may have been for naught. Now, I say that knowing it's important to do something you're proud of yourself, that you can live with literally if nobody buys. That's important, I think, as a writer to be cool with that. But at the same time, I think you want to have, entertainment, sure, but impact, and to change and to get people to think. So I would start by taking your most dearly held assumption first. Start with the big one. And the thing I'm working on with Pete is it's set in the further future.
But actually, this reminds me of another of these sort of distinguishing characteristics of artists, which August said, but I want to underscore, and that is they're not just willing to, but they are hungry for the truly unthinkable problem. All right, I've done a lot of both in business and in government, planning, and there is a groupthink that actually prevents the actual really hard problems. That are actually not permissible, that artists are not constrained by. There's a question right here.
I don't know why we don't have a DoD Kickstarter. I'm thinking of those young people who are doing the 3D.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, Britt Blazer, NewGov Foundation.
Thank you.
I'm thinking of those bright young engineers with their 3D printed waveguides, presumably. Why couldn't they just lay $100,000 on those kids? Here, go do something. We're doing Kickstarter in a week. And have that be DOD money. If a group of people got together, hey, this makes sense, DOD, just do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of what was said here that I forget who said it now. Where he called a bunch of people in with gray hair over the age of 50 to solve a propaganda problem, and they all kind of were like this. But he called a bunch of 28-year-olds in from Silicon Valley. Is this your point? And they said, here's 15 ideas in the next 15 minutes. I'm sorry, did either of you or any of you want to respond to this?
Sort of on that point, it's I think this room might be surprised by how many people in our field would be fascinated and delighted to actually help with problems of national security. And I think there are, as we've discussed already, very, very clear ways in which they can do that. And there's different levels, I think, at which people could help. I think there are, young people who could come up with, interested in new, completely outside the box ideas on how things could be solved. I also think, there are people, who've had a lot of success in the kind of industries we've had, whether it be film or, video games or whatever it is. They got tons of money and they're still relatively young and they're very, very smart people. and they have an ability to help. But the last thing they would ever expect to be asked to do is to participate in something like this. But I think they would have a great deal to offer. So yeah, it's...
I call this the fly-off mentality, the fly-off culture. That's separate from fly-offs as a way of doing contracts. I was involved in the SR-71 program. About 2 years from drawing board to flying, okay? Now that was because it was in a fly-off mentality. They had a contract, but they thought that way. They thought like agile programmers do today. But now we design every weapon system like healthcare.gov. I mean, that's a great big spec, and we screw it up.
I mean, on Kickstarter already, there are national security relevant technologies. The Sprite satellite's a great example out of Cornell. You know, there is something there that has relevance, like in the sensor context in space, that came about because of Kickstarter. And I don't know that you necessarily, at this point in the way the defense establishment is oriented, want to tether them to the red tape. I think this is one of the advantages of Kickstarter. It's quite linear. You may be better off actually looking at either a DARPA model, which is unencumbered, or having savvy investors who have a national security mindset, looking at opportunities like that in the sense you're creating a Kickstarter-type enterprise, a mini venture fund.
Dave's, thank you, August. Dave's comments remind me, I was out in Los Angeles for an event, and a rather storied member of the aerospace community gave me 10 minutes on the symbiosis of Hollywood and aerospace, that it is not a coincidence that those two industries in the 20th century settled and took root there. There's a, think about, just for the sake of the fun of it, the resemblance between a movie soundstage and an airplane hangar. There's a question right there. We'll take a couple. Oh, I'm sorry, David.
If I could,
please.
The National Academy of Sciences has created what's called the Hollywood Science Exchange, which is an attempt to match both television and film Hollywood with science advisors. And I just finished consulting with a Sci-Fi Channel show. And the notion is to try to, ensure that there's some degree of friendliness, that there's someone on the set who's saying, you know, you could get the same drama and
Be authentic.
and be authentic. And it doesn't always, not all advice is followed. Cuaron in Gravity, for example, followed a lot of advice, and it was very, very, but you had to go along with what he needed for artistic purposes, and that is to assume that low Earth orbit is the size of LA County. But other than that, but the 128 culture, that's the route outside Boston, right? The 128 culture versus Silicon Valley is a legendary trade-off. And the Pentagon naturally drifts towards 128 culture because it needs results. It needs something that won't kill the pilots. Silicon Valley culture is throw it out there, it will be flawed, our users will repair it for us. But this is why I'm saying that what's missing, and we saw this in all of the previous speakers here, is so much better than all the other Pax empires. They do try, but it always stops at anticipation and professionalism. It never, almost never, goes over the next step, which would enable us to use Silicon Valley culture. And that is there a portion of this that can be tossed to the citizenry and that they can be involved in the solving of these national security problems?
I'm going to only have time for one more question, sorry, and then we'll wrap up. And we could continue, you could then engage the panel over reception. Please.
John Hanachek, Atlantic Council in Georgetown. We're looking now at a world that is basically seeing ideas become distilled to perfection, right?
Couldn't hear you.
Ideas have been distilled, right? The memification of the world. So General Dempsey talked about how now networks are in the same league as nation states. We're finding nation states need to compete for relevancy with other unifying ideas. Terrorist networks like Al-Qaeda are rallying people behind them in direct ways. So I think David Brin brought this up. The idea that we need a new message to rally people behind the nation state that is the United States. It's not enough to be something anymore. You have to work at it. You have to be worth following. So I asked to the storytellers, what stories should the United States tell people to make us again believe in them? and want to follow them. I think it's a key
A
problem.
perfect question on which to wrap up the panel, actually. Thank you.
Simply having some sort of channel to get people more involved and have the decision-making more transparent, I think would be a great help. Because I think there's a lot of mistrust from the people of the government today, particularly of younger people, because, yeah, they get the opportunity to vote once every 4 years for a president, once every 2 in the local elections, but really that's all they can do. And they want a voice. And this is not going to go away. I think David Brin's absolutely right about that. These are people who can be empowered, and along the lines of what you were saying, where the assumption is that there's people who just can't help, and what could these people actually tell us or help us, I think is absolutely right.
August, what's a story we should be following?
I think that the narrative that the U.S. is a place where the world's best ideas can come and thrive, and that includes those that we generate ourselves. If people feel like they're not being dealt fair decks, if they feel like the system is not providing them a safe environment to be innovative, to just be in community, then the very purpose of the whole thing is in question. But if you can reinforce that narrative with truth, importantly, because you have to start somewhere if you're talking about narrative, I think that's a great place to do it.
I think you're both completely full of wisdom.
My heart stopped like that. This is live.
Learns the tricks with her. I think you're completely right, and I think that one of the things we have got to do is, as we're riding this rising wave of accountability, and even freedom is still rising though in the world, though not as fast as in the 90s, and violence, we need to find some ways of persuading people, A, to stop the stupid freaking civil war, forgive me, but secondly, to notice good news with bad. Because bad news is so engendering of the greatest of all drugs, self-righteous indignation. And it's fine because it helps us to tilt at windmills. But there has to be included some degree of hope. And this means, as you said, restoring trust is right at the top of the agenda right now. And I'll be talking about some ways that we could do that tomorrow at the Internet Society. But what it comes down to is we have got to persuade those who are involved in defense to look to us more. And us, I mean everyone out here, instead of just thinking of us as people to protect, because your predecessors in the protector caste did not look at us that way. And we have to, as storytellers, tell a more complex tale, because the reflex of automatically treating our citizens as sheep and our institutions as evil is lazy, and it just makes storytelling easy, but it's destructive.
Defense strategy needs a narrative, and we should engage storytellers, professional storytellers, to help fill in that part of the task. So I want all of us to thank this panel, all of whom, as I say, have flown here. But then I would ask you all to just stand by 1 second so I can turn the floor over to Barry Pavel, the director of the Scowcroft Center, to round things off.
Thanks very much.
Here.
I'm the one standing between you and nice refreshments, and so I'll be very quick. But I just wanted to thank you for your participation, but make it very clear that this conference is a sort of a way station for us. We've done a lot of work over the last 2 years, in particular working with people like Matt Burrows, who is now directing the strategic foresight work here. Matt and I used to have conversations when we were both in the government. I used to be one of these defense strategy planners that didn't talk to you and didn't do enough of what we should be doing here. And so we'll be doing more of this. And so don't think of this as the end and go back and say that was a great conference. We welcome your input. We welcome your engagement. We're talking to the decision makers all the time. Some of the people who were on this stage today and said some things as a result of conferences like this, where we then fed them some of what we thought were the most important insights. So please keep engaging us. We will be doing this again. But I think the communities we brought together for the first time in a while, at least for me, I learned an enormous amount from this last panel, and I think if we can get these different communities together in these conversations, then we can help remove some of the most important impediments. I think the biggest one you raised at the end, and Steve Hadley raised on his panel, and that is the culture of the organizations and the different communities, and how do we start to change those mindsets. So thank you very much. Keep the conversation going on Twitter and in real life and on email and archaic things like that.